In September of 1898, a 9-year-old boy walks into a Barnardo's orphanage. The building sits in Stepney, in the East End of London. His father died on Christmas Day the year before, and his mother cannot feed him. The intake form notes his good health and records his height. He stands 4 feet tall, which is perfectly normal for his age. Within months, Barnardo ships him across the Atlantic to work on a Canadian farm. He is 9 years old, completely alone, and now property of the system. He returns to England at 15, and something has changed inside him. A congenital knee problem has triggered uncontrolled bone growth in his legs. By 22, he towers at 7 feet 4 inches. By 1913, he exceeds 7 feet 9 inches and is still growing. And here is where this story turns from sad to something else entirely. A director at Barnardo's personally volunteers him for a public exhibition. The event is a parade of giants at the Crystal Palace in London. The event celebrates the coronation of King George V. The boy is billed as the biggest boy in Britain. His name is Frederick Kempster. Within weeks of that exhibition, circus promoters come calling. Frederick signs with Astley and Company's American Circus. He tours Europe under stage names like Teddy Bobbs and Frederick the Great. His real height is 7 feet 9 inches, but management bills him at 8 feet 4, sometimes 8 feet 8. The exaggeration sells more tickets. Frederick Kempster, orphan, farm labourer, charity case, is now a professional giant. He will spend the rest of his short life being stared at for money. He contracts influenza while touring in Blackburn in 1918. The illness develops into pneumonia. He never recovers. He is 29 years old when he is buried in a 9-foot coffin in Blackburn Cemetery. His gravestone reads, "The British Giant." Not his name, his product label. I need you to understand what happened here. A child entered a charitable institution at a normal height. That institution shipped him overseas as unpaid labor. When his body began growing beyond medical explanation, that same institution delivered him to the entertainment industry. A Barnardo's director, J.P. Manuel, made the introduction. This was not a rogue employee. This was an institutional decision. The orphanage that was supposed to protect Frederick Kempster instead turned his body into a commodity. And Frederick's case is only remarkable because it is documented. His great-nephew James Kempster confirmed family details publicly decades later. His siblings kept his memory alive. His intake records survived. His circus contracts are traceable. For every Frederick Kempster whose story we can reconstruct, how many others passed through the same systems without anyone recording what happened to them? The numbers demand the question. Between 1869 and 1948, Barnardo's alone shipped approximately 30,000 children from Britain to Canada. The broader Home Children program moved over 100,000. On the American side, the orphan train system relocated an estimated 250,000 children between 1854 and 1929. Combined, these systems processed more than 350,000 children in the same decades. The sideshow industry reached its peak. Pituitary gigantism occurs in roughly 8 cases per million people. It typically begins in early childhood when a tumor on the pituitary gland causes excess growth hormone production. Children appear normal at birth. The growth acceleration starts between ages 3 and 7. By age 9, some stand 6 feet tall. By 14, they tower over every adult in the room. Do the arithmetic. 350,000 children processed across both systems, 8 cases of gigantism per million people. The math says at least 2 or 3 children would have developed visible gigantism during their institutional years. That is a conservative estimate. In reality, the number was likely higher. These systems drew from populations experiencing poverty, malnutrition, and disease, conditions that can mask or delay diagnosis. Children with unusual growth would have been noticed by matrons and doctors during intake examinations. The other children in the dormitory would have watched them outgrow every bed. What happened to those children? Consider what we know about the ones with names. Edouard Beaupré was born in 1881 in Willow Bunch, Saskatchewan. Normal at birth. By age 9, he stood 6 feet tall. By 17, 7 feet 1 inch. His family needed money. A neighbor suggested he could earn a living touring as a strongman. Edouard left home at 17, chaperoned by family friends, and spent his remaining years on the sideshow circuit. He was shy, he hated crowds, he hated cities. He drank to cope. Tuberculosis consumed him. He collapsed at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904 and never recovered. He was 23, but that is not the worst of it. After Edouard died, his father traveled to St. Louis to bring the body home. He He could not afford the transportation costs. Think about that for a moment. The circus profited from Edouard for years. When he collapsed, the business simply moved on. And his father, the man who raised him, could not scrape together enough money to bury his own son. The undertakers embalmed the body and put it on display in a storefront window. Police shut that down. A businessman shipped the body to Montreal, where it was exhibited at the entrance of a museum for over 6 months. Then the circus that had it went bankrupt and dumped the body in a warehouse. In 1907, children playing in the warehouse found his preserved remains. The University of Montreal claimed the body, mummified it, and placed it in a glass case. The family did not discover what had happened until 1967. They fought for decades to recover the remains. The university refused. It took until 1989 for the family to finally retrieve what was left of Edouard Beaupré. He was cremated and buried in 1990, 86 years after his death. 86 years during which his naked, mummified body was on display for medical students and curiosity seekers. His family's words still echo. How could they do that to someone and erase them? It is like they never existed. That phrase keeps repeating across these histories. Erased. Like they never existed. It describes the home children too. An estimated 65% of British home children in Canada were abused. Children forced to sleep in barns. Children forbidden from eating with the families that were supposed to care for them. One girl was whipped, beaten, and moved 20 times in less than 8 years. She was 14 when she gave birth to a stillborn baby. 75 children were found buried in unmarked graves in a single Toronto cemetery. A researcher using archival records and death certificates identified every one of them. They represent everything that was wrong with child immigration, she said. And Barnardo's, the organization that processed Frederick Kempster, had a specific documented pattern that makes all of this worse. Thomas Barnardo was taken to court multiple times by parents trying to recover their own children. In one case, he sent 2 children abroad and hid a third. The court issued writs of habeas corpus demanding their return. Barnardo claimed he had no knowledge of their whereabouts. A researcher studying his organization described it plainly. He built himself an industry, and that industry had to be fed children. Parents placed their children in Barnardo's homes as a temporary measure during hard times. They returned to find their children had been shipped to another continent without consent. The system was not designed to reunite families. It was designed to move bodies from one place to another with as little accountability as possible. Let me address the skeptic's position directly. Frederick Kempster's case may be unique. One documented instance of an orphanage delivering a giant child to a circus does not prove a systematic pipeline. The incomplete records might reflect genuine administrative chaos rather than deliberate concealment. Most children in these systems were placed with families, not exhibited. Some found good homes. The sideshow industry was, for some performers, a genuine source of income and community in an era that offered few alternatives to people with unusual bodies. I held that position for nearly 2 weeks. I reviewed every counter-argument. I wanted the mainstream explanation to work because the alternative is ugly. But what broke me was not any single piece of evidence. It was the realization that the official narrative rests entirely on the absence of evidence. We do not know how many children with unusual growth pass through these institutions because the records are incomplete. We do not know what happened to children who disappeared between intake and placement because the files are sealed. We do not know whether other Frederick Kempsters existed because Barnardo's, the Children's Aid Society, and the New York Foundling Hospital will not open their archives for independent review. The absence of proof is doing all the work. And institutions asking us to trust them are the same ones that shipped children overseas without consent, the same ones that lost track of thousands and buried 75 of them in unmarked graves. Ella Ewing was born in 1872 in Missouri, normal-sized as a baby, abnormal growth beginning at age 7, 6 feet 10 inches by 14, over 8 feet 4 by adulthood. A museum agent named Louis Epstein traveled from Chicago to rural Missouri specifically to recruit her after hearing rumors. He offered $1,000 for 27 days of exhibition. Her father initially refused. He thought it clashed with their Baptist values, but the money exceeded what he could earn in 5 years of farming. Ella spent 17 years on the circuit. She had parents who negotiated her contracts. She had a community who knew her. She had a name the whole time. The sideshow photographers tell us something different about the giants who had none of those protections. Charles Eisenman operated a studio on the Bowery in New York from the 1870s through the 1890s. The Bowery was the entertainment district, home to dime museums and cheap amusements. It was also just blocks from the orphanages, processing thousands of children each year. Eisenman photographed hundreds of performers. His subjects include giants, but many of them carry only stage names. Their biographies were written by promoters who invented whatever story would sell tickets. Their real origins were fabricated or left blank entirely. Robert Bogdan, the Syracuse University professor who wrote the definitive academic study of the American sideshow, put it simply: for a lot of the people in these acts, there are no written records, just the pictures, giants in photographs. No birth records, no family, no origin beyond whatever story sold tickets. Where did they come from? Who were they before the stage name? That question matters more when you understand what the sideshow industry did with giant bodies even after death. Edouard Beaupré was not an isolated case. The exploitation did not end when the performer stopped breathing, it accelerated. The Irish giant Charles Byrne begged to be buried at sea after his death in 1783. The surgeon John Hunter purchased his corpse against Byrne's explicit wishes. The skeleton was displayed at the Royal College of Surgeons in London for over 200 years. It was only removed in 2023 after a sustained public campaign. Giants were not just exhibited alive, they were collected dead. Their bodies were treated as specimens, as property, as curiosities worth more than the living person who inhabited them. If the system treated giant adults this way, adults with names and families and public profiles, what did it do with giant children who had no one? You might be closer to this story than you realize. An estimated 2 million Americans descend from orphan train riders. As many as 4 million Canadians carry home children ancestry. If your family tree hits a wall somewhere between 1870 and 1900, these systems may be the reason. If there is a name that changes inexplicably or a generation that simply goes blank, you are not alone. The institutions that processed these children sealed their records. The New York Foundling Hospital provides only non-identifying information to descendants. Barnardo's archives remain restricted. The Children's Aid Society requires proof of relation before releasing any files. The people who severed these children's identities are the same people controlling access to the evidence, and they have maintained that control for over a century. The records are not missing. They are locked. Frederick Kempster entered a Barnardo's orphanage at 4 feet tall. He left the sideshow circuit in a 9-foot coffin. Between those two measurements lies a story the institution that processed him has never been required to explain. Not because the explanation would be innocent, because nobody with the authority to demand one ever has. Barnardo's has never publicly addressed how one of its directors came to volunteer an orphanage child for exhibition. The records of other children who passed through the same system during the same decades remain sealed. The names are still in those files. The intake measurements are still there. The transfer records, or the absence of transfer records, are still there. 350,000 children move through these systems. We celebrate the ones who became governors and farmers and family patriarchs. We mourn the ones found in unmarked graves. But between those outcomes, in the gap between the celebrated and the buried, there is a third category nobody talks about. The ones who became exhibits. The ones whose bodies were worth more on display than on a farm. The ones whose unusual growth made them valuable to an industry that peaked in the exact decade these institutions processed their highest volumes of children. Frederick Kempster is the only one we can name with certainty. Edouard Beaupré had family who fought for 86 years to bring him home. The giants in Eisenman's photographs had no one at all. Their images survive in university archives and auction catalogues. Their names do not. And until someone opens those sealed records and maps every intake against every outcome, the gap remains. Until someone accounts for every child whose body outgrew the institution that was supposed to protect them, we are left trusting the same organizations that ship children across oceans, the same ones that refused to return them to their parents, the same ones that buried 75 of them in an unmarked Toronto grave. We are trusting them to tell us nothing else went wrong. The photographs persist. The sealed files persist. The gap between what we know and what we are allowed to know persists wider than any doorway in any government building. And somewhere in that gap, children who grew too tall for their orphanage beds disappeared. They vanished into a system that had every incentive to profit from their bodies, and no mechanism to stop it.